let's get the show started. Welcome to today's UX Subnetwork and today's webinar titled Building Trust and Collaborating with Communities in the City of Philadelphia. I'm Beck Center Fellow Kirsten Wyatt, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's presentation. The Digital Service Network is a growing peer learning network that connects and supports digital service teams and professionals who use data, design, and technology to improve government services. The Digital Service Network is supported by the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown and the U.S. Digital Response. And so today's presentation is for our UX subnetwork. And this is a closed group subnetwork of the Digital Service Network that connects current government employees who work in or are interested in user research and user experience. And so while today's presentation is part of the subnetwork, we are excited to have some new faces join us in this space who are joining us to learn and share. And we opened it up to our full community because, frankly, we are in love with our guest speakers today. We are very excited to have Danita Reese, the Deputy Director of Strategic Design, and Andrea Ngan, the Community Co-Design Practice Lead from the Philadelphia Service Design Studio. And they are going to share more information today about their work developing the Equitable Community Engagement Toolkit. And this toolkit was created to serve as a compass for equitable community engagement within city government, and it provides guidance, stories, tools, and training on how city employees can center equity in their work. Danita and Andrea will share more about their journey developing the toolkit, the lessons they learned along the way, and you'll have time to ask your questions. We do hope you'll sign up for the Digital Service Network email list, and we're here to be responsive to your needs and develop more events just like this one to help you advance your work in your organization. And so just a few more housekeeping notes, and then I'll stop talking. A recording and recap from today's event will be available online after we close today. And you'll have time for questions, so just use that chat box to ask questions while Danita and Andrea are presenting, and we'll make sure we ask them in the recording. When you're engaging with our DSN community, we expect you to adhere to our shared community norms. These community norms help us ensure that we are creating a shared space of trust and productivity. So please be kind and respectful in your communication, make space and take space, promote a collaborative and supportive environment, respect this as a safe and confidential space, stay curious, assume goodwill. And with that, finally, I'll hand it over to Danita and Andrea. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having us. We're really thrilled and grateful to be here. Andrea, thank you as always for sharing some slides. I'll go ahead and reintroduce myself, but yeah, I'm Danita Reese. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the Deputy Director of the Philadelphia Service Design Studio. I'm a Black woman. Today, I'm wearing some dark frame glasses. I have shoulder length, dark brown, almost black dreadlocks that are at my shoulders. And I'm wearing a black t-shirt. Behind me is a wall of artwork of things that I love that light me up. And I'm really thrilled to be here. So I will pause and allow Andrea to introduce herself to y'all as well.
Yeah, thank you, Danita. And thank you for being with us today. I'm Andrea Ngan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Community Co-Design Practice Lead at the PHL Service Design Studio. I am a Chinese American woman in my mid-30s with long black hair, gold earrings, and a blue sweater on. I'm just here at home in my home studio office.
Beautiful. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with this practice of providing visual descriptions, we always just like to start our presentations with a little explanation why we do it. It's something that we learned and were guided by community members that we've been working with over the last 3+, nearly 4 years. But we recognize that people are living with a wide range of abilities and experiences. And so many of us have learned, that sharing our pronouns, for instance, demonstrates respect, and it helps to create a welcoming space for everyone. Providing visual descriptions ensures that people who are blind or visually impaired are included in the conversation. It's also really useful and helpful for those who might be dialing into a call or temporarily unable to access video features. And on the low, we're discovering that it's really a rather delightful mechanism that helps people to not only choose how they want to present themselves, but you kind of learn a little bit about people's flavor as they describe themselves too. So yeah. Are we ready? Are we sharing slides? Can't see.
Oh, you can't see them.
Oh, it's fine if they're there, but I can't see them.
Let's see. How's that?
Oh, you're good. You're good.
Awesome.
Beautiful. All right. So to get into why we're here today, we've structured this presentation into 4 sections. So we'll start by just sharing a little bit more about the Service Design Studio. Then we'll talk you through how we've approached building the Equitable Community Engagement Toolkit and why collaborative methods were really central to our process. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the toolkit to really talk to y'all and share some lessons that we've learned along the way from stewarding this co-creation. And then we've left some time for conversation at the end, as Kirsten mentioned. So one thing that we want you to keep in mind as we go through this is that, you know, this presentation is all neatly tied up and presented, but the act of doing this work within government space has been and is messy. So we've often been left with more questions than answers. So we'll pause throughout the presentation. Y'all are welcome to continue to leave things in the chat for us to get into conversation about, but we're really hoping to just sort of peel back the layers of our work with you today. So yeah, let's get into it. I'll start by sharing a little bit about the studio. So the PHL Service Design Studio is a small but mighty team of design researchers, strategists, and co-design facilitators. We partner with city agencies to make city services more accessible, equitable, and trauma-informed. We do this by centering the voices of both residents and colleagues within city staff in the design and decision-making process. And so to that end, we collaborate with residents or community members, as we'll refer to them throughout this presentation, city staff, leaders, and partner organizations to ensure service improvement efforts honor everyone's needs. The studio is housed within the office of the Chief Administrative Officer at the city. We refer to it as the CAO because whoop, whoop, we love our acronyms too. The CAO currently oversees 8 city departments and offices, and the mission of the CAO is to strengthen the city's internal administrative functions while improving city service delivery in partnership with our operating agencies. And so because the CAO is a cabinet level office, our department has the benefit of having a macro level view of service improvement efforts that can happen across the city. The foundation of our team is really built on a long history within city government of using human-centered design to improve Philadelphians' interactions with government. So about 8 years ago, the city committed to improving its digital service delivery by designing, developing, and launching a new municipal website, today known as phila.gov. That redesign was and has been significant because it triggered a movement within city government where we were able to center the needs of residents in the design of digital applications, websites, and now services. So over the years, we've been able to build teams in user experience design, content strategy, open source, web development, and eventually service design, all inside of government. In 2017, our super small team at the time received a grant from the Knight Foundation. Through this grant, we were able to hire our first service design fellow, our colleague Devika Menon. And together with Leanna, they pursued the city's first large-scale service design project with the Office of Homeless Services. And so it was through this project and service design capacity building activities across the city and loads of workshops that we received the internal support to permanently establish the Service Design Studio in February of 2020. Which is when Andrea and I joined the team, you know, just 1 month before the great pandemic. So the scope of research, evaluation, and design and delivery we do on a project can vary within the studio. It can be broad or narrow and often somewhere in between. One example of some broad work that we've done was the work with the Office of Homeless Services, but also, as you'll see on the left of this slide, the Discover Benefits Anti-Poverty Initiative. With this work, we conducted some qualitative research to really understand the landscape of benefits access and identify what role a benefits access tool could play in the city's anti-poverty efforts. We have also an example of some of the narrower work that we've done that's really focused is we worked with the Office of Immigrant Affairs to test the effectiveness of a newly written and designed voter guide, which really helped or sought to help residents navigate the vote by mail process before really it was launched broadly. So you can find more details about this project on the website that was shared in the resources. We've also written blogs about a lot of our work, which you can also access through that page. But we're here today to really talk about the Equitable Community Engagement Toolkit and the work that we've co-led and co-created over the last 3 years with engagement practitioners within the city and also with community members. And so the toolkit in this context, as we'll refer to it, is a little bit of a misnomer. For us, it's both a program and a practice, and it's supported by this digital tool, which is the website, that serves as a compass for how to conduct equitable community engagement within city government. So the toolkit itself provides guidance, stories, tools, and also some information about training on how to center equity in your work. So to give you greater context for how and why we approached building the toolkit, I'll pass it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Danita. So the creation of the engagement toolkit was facilitated by our studio, the Service Design Studio, in partnership with the City of Philadelphia's Digital Services team and an office formerly known as the Office of Civic Engagement and Volunteer Service. So as Danita mentioned, our unit within the Chief Administrative Officer supports service improvement efforts across city government. And the digital services team really focuses on developing accessible, intuitive digital services for the public. They're the folks who stood up Phila.gov. And the Office of Civic Engagement and Volunteer Service has since moved and now sits within the Office of Community Empowerment and Opportunity. So their work really focuses on building capacity for strategic community engagement efforts, and the team houses a network of volunteers and provides national service and community education programs. And so that is where the toolkit is now getting embedded. But just to kind of pull back and give you an overview for why the toolkit is important to Philadelphia and to the city of Philadelphia. It was initiated based on the belief that within a democratic system, people have the right to inform decisions that impact their lives and their futures. So community engagement is an important mechanism for government to share decision-making power with the people that it serves, or at least it's one. And we know that within the US, there are diverse, gender, language, race, and many other identities that make up our country. But many of our dominant cultures favor English-speaking, able-bodied, Christian, cisgender, heterosexual, wealthy, generally white men. And so this favoritism and bias has been built into our systems and institutions, largely because lived experiences, diverse lived experiences, aren't centered in a lot of decision-making processes. And so as a result, our society, our policies, our programs, our services can, build a lot of inequitable gaps. And so across the country, this shows up in the form of divestment in neighborhoods of color, discriminatory policies and practices, and disenfranchisement of Indigenous, Black, Brown, immigrant, LGBTQ, IA+, low-income communities, and people with disabilities. In Philadelphia, for many who call the city home, the systemic divestment, discriminatory policies, and disenfranchisement of communities has resulted in too many harmful forms of engagement. And perhaps none greater than in May 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department bombed a residential block on 62nd and Osage Ave in West Philadelphia that was occupied by Black liberation group MOVE. So the bombing led to the death of 5 children and 6 adults. And this isn't the first instance of harm communities have experienced in Philadelphia. This event speaks to the deep intergenerational trauma and pain that has reverberated across the city for decades. And these wounds only became more apparent in 2020 with the onset of COVID-19, or what we sometimes call the Great Unveiling. So in 2020, while we were at the height of the pandemic, George Floyd's murder sparked the uprisings in support of the movement for Black lives. And those protests led to the tear gassing of protesters. Dominique Remy Fells, a Black trans woman, was also murdered. There was anti-Asian hate and violence erupting. There were housing protests, and there was the murder of Walter Wallace Jr., a Black man experiencing a mental health crisis in West Philadelphia by Philadelphia police. So all of this was happening at the time when residents really needed the city to provide critical life-sustaining services, and yet trust in government was low for many, non-existent for others. And a coalition of community engagement staff across the city of Philadelphia came together to figure out a way forward, figure out a way to engage communities equitably. And so through this coalition, which is called the Equitable Engagement Collaborative, we witnessed engagement practitioners discuss and share the challenges they faced repairing relationships and the harm that the city had directly or indirectly inflicted upon its residents and its impact. At the time, community engagement was frequently and unfortunately under-resourced and undervalued in terms of money, time, and dedicated staff support. So city agencies carried out often rushed engagement strategies in urgent timelines, lacked shared knowledge about how to conduct community engagement well, lacked sort of historical context before entering communities. That sort of urgency and lack of planfulness often led to inconsistent, extractive, reactive, or representational engagements for residents. And so as one city engagement staff put it, we shouldn't be making decisions without the people who are most affected by those decisions, not just at the table, but fully embedded in decision-making. And so this kind of set us off on our quest. So to date, we've worked with over 160 people to build the toolkit. An estimated 80 community members and 80 city engagement staff, separately, sometimes together, over the course of almost 2 years, informed the base vision for the toolkit. We also collaborated with 13 city advisors who offered recommendations for how to prioritize language, disability, digital access, racial equity, and how to reduce harm with trauma-informed, healing-centered sort of lens. Many also helped co-write guidance and improve procedures to support equitable engagement. We also piloted this toolkit with 4 different engagement teams across 4 city agencies to understand how guidance was working and wasn't working. So we worked with the Budget Office, Water Department, Public Health, and Office of Immigrant Affairs. We assembled a community advisory council who offered feedback and infused their own lived experience into guidance that most impact them and their communities. So essentially they checked us on a lot of assumptions or things missing even from guidance. And last but not least, our colleagues at the Office of Innovation and Technology led the user experience design and development of the toolkit website, while the design firm GD Loft helped us make the visual branding and illustrations across the website to kind of begin to help put a visual language to some of the ideas that we were coming together around. But the collaborative nature of this work has really necessitated a process that evolved over time, and it really required us to remain open to sort of unforeseen and emergent needs. To locate this work in time, we kicked off this project in September 2020, facilitating focus groups, collaborative design sessions, conducting deep qualitative research with people both inside and outside of city government. We then moved into prototyping phase. We applied for and then received a grant from the Operations Transformation Fund, which I believe is federal funding that came down to the city that allowed us to really hire fellows to help us write the toolkit, build the website prototype, and support the piloting of this work. In January, we piloted the toolkit internally with those 4 partners and city agencies I had mentioned to really test toolkit guidance and tools. We also formed a community advisory council who held us accountable to a lot of things we were saying in the toolkit. And then we publicly launched this beta version, of which you still have access to right now, in June. And we've shifted our focus to translating content and improving accessibility in preparation for a full launch in the new year. And so if you see some translation errors, just know we are actively working on that with our translators. We've also shifted our focus to refining the program and identifying a steward for the program, which is the Chief Empowerment and or Community Empowerment and Opportunity, CEO team that we had mentioned earlier. So finally, the Equitable Community Engagement Toolkit is meant to be an ecosystem of supports for the City of Philadelphia and engagement staff. The digital tool we launched in June 2023 includes over 30 guides that feature all of these digital language, disability access, racial equity, and harm reduction guidance, along with conditional sort of requirements to do engagement equitably. There's over 30 downloadable tools to apply those guides, and then stories of equitable practices to help bring to life what this actually looks like. Training overview content helps people access live trainings. There's also feedback forms across the site for continual improvement, and translations, which are currently in progress, are also available in the top 2 languages spoken in Philadelphia. We like to say that the digital toolkit is just one facet within this ecosystem. And so in the near term, it felt important to provide supportive tools and collective vision and a strategy for sustained change. In the long term, we hope that this ecosystem provides consulting services, training, a space for community practice, advocacy, and a governance structure to ensure that we're accountable and responsive to needs of practitioners over time, since this is a living practice that doesn't necessarily have an end date or an arrival point. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Danita for some lessons learned.
So that is, the overview, but what have we learned in the process of these last 3.5 years? And so again, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, this work in this government context has been messy and challenging, but it's also been incredibly rewarding. It's changed both Andrea and my life in big ways and in small ways. And we've had so much support from our colleagues, both within our Service Design Studio team, the Chief Administrative Office, our project partners, and just the city, all those practitioners that come together in the EEC to just lift us up, hold us accountable. So what we want to do now is just share a bit about some of the things that we've learned, and we've learned a lot, y'all. We could be here for days, but we really just want to talk through some high-level takeaways that we are continuing to talk about. I think Andrea and I are always having tea, talking about change and collaboration and building trust and helping folks shift to really seeing equity as an embodied practice and a process versus a destination that comes with, a nice rubber stamp and a gold-plated certificate, which, often, for better or for worse, government loves to be like, here's your certificate. But anyway, to get into it, we've spent many, many hours really just trying to understand how to create the conditions that are necessary for things like change, collaboration, and trust. Both with our colleagues within city government and also with community members. And so I just want to send a shout out to one of our advisors, Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart, who really has given us language for how to talk about things. And so you'll hear Andrea and I say create the conditions a lot. And that is a phrase that we learned from her. But we've learned a few things about collaboration from this work. And one of the first is really prioritizing collaboration is a mechanism to combat dominant culture that you've heard us both refer to earlier in this presentation. And by inviting diverse co-creators into collaboration and being really intentional about creating a bridge between community and government practitioners, we've been able to serve as accountability partners and check each other when dominant norms and biases show up. So one example of this that will always sit with me is that, we were working with our Community Advisory Council and reworking and reviewing the language access guide, which is in the radical inclusion section. And, folks in that space really challenged us to acknowledge that, we'd centered English as the default. And all the guidance was written from that context. The way that we talked about everything was written from or was spoken about as though English is the center. And, I just remember one day we were like, doing our spiel and we were like Asian, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities. And two of our folks were just like, they were Middle Eastern and Latin heritage. And they just were like, there's really no translation for Brown that makes sense in either of our languages. And so, that really checked us in a moment and a lot encouraged us to really go through the rest of the guidance and figure out, how do we acknowledge within the toolkit itself the role colonization and dominant culture play and have played in how we create the conditions to really collaborate with staff and community members who speak multiple languages. So that was just one lesson that we've been sitting with, and just as the toolkit evolves is always something that we'll continue to revisit. A second lesson that we've learned involves investing in resources, staff, and time. Collaborating with diverse stakeholders requires us to show up with resources and skilled staff and to be open and to emergent processes. So much of this work was emergent. And often fixed timelines and rigid expectations really could drain the collaborative and creative spirit from efforts. And we see that often. We hear that often when we're talking to our colleagues. And so, we were intentional about taking our time to develop this toolkit over the last 3 years because we really wanted to prioritize things like seeking funding to ensure that we had the capacity to pay participants for their time and their lived experience. And we also needed that additional funding to be able to hire and build a team to develop the website and to write the guidance and to, grow the toolkit into what it is today. And I'd say that lastly, collaboration for us has really focused on how do we figure out ways to share decision-making power. So collaboration itself necessitates that every stakeholder understands what their power is in a process, whether that's actual or perceived. There's an entire guide about power in the toolkit. And this is just one reason why we prioritize lived experience as much as possible over more traditional approaches to subject matter expertise. And by inviting diverse co-creators with lived and embodied experiences, it was really critical for collaboration that could generate the transformation that equity really requires. And so that is us talking about collaboration. The second thing that was a real biggie for us and lessons that we're continuing to draw from is around trust. And it's really just, trust is built upon every stage, like the impact that happens at every stage. And so just want to start off by just a small distinction that's actually a significant distinction that, we're not saying trust in government. Like that is a phrase that I think Andrea and I hear often. And, we just don't agree. I'm just going to say it like that. We believe that trust is really built into every correspondence, every touch, every interaction that happens. And it's with the people that are involved. It's highly relational. It's about the promises that we make and deliver on and the ways that we show up as facilitators in each interaction. Trust lives in how we treat ourselves and how we treat our collaborators and our colleagues. And we'd often ask ourselves, throughout our work, like, have we been accountable to what we've promised? And if we haven't, how do we atone for that? How do we show up? But it's really from this place of accountability that we're constantly grappling with, can people trust us? And can they trust this process? And so, we did things in big ways and in small ways, but one clear way that we built trust with our community members in particular was by asking people what they needed upfront and often throughout our interactions, whether it was accommodations, whether it was materials, if they just wanted extra one-on-one time with us. And that over time enabled us to really build a solid foundation of trust that fostered healthy working relationships. I think another lesson that I'm thinking about is, and it's something that I'm always passionate about and always talking about with the team, is like, how do we prioritize centering everyone's humanity and dignity? We talk about trust in government, but we have to realize that government is comprised of people. And, it's necessary to remind ourselves constantly that when we make decisions for people or exude power over them, we're taking away people's humanity, we're taking away their agency, we're compromising their sense of dignity. And so we, try to avoid demonstrating that lack of respect with people and instead finding ways to honor people's lived wisdom. So one example of that is, we created shared agreements. I often found myself saying, this is a safe space. But, over time, community members in our conversations, like they checked me on that and us on that. And they were just like, that's actually not for you to declare. We tell you when an environment is safe. You just have to figure out what conditions you need to create that enable us to show up in those ways. And so, just encouraging y'all as you do this work or, endeavor to do this kind of work to recognize when you might be prioritizing the outputs of something over the humanity and dignity of people. And don't be afraid to pause or check in with yourself and your teammates and other colleagues. Like that, when you have that inkling, it's likely an indication that you need to tune into something important that you might need to reevaluate or consider changing. And the last thing that I'll say around this point before I'll toss it back to Andrea is just, we are always centering care and just thinking about how can we show care to each other, to ourselves. And it's care, we think about it, people over output, people over profit. All of those things are constantly, in the backlogs of our minds as we're doing this work. And so when we ask you how you're doing, we really want to know. And we often, did not care that it ate up 45 minutes of a meeting. And so that's just one way that showing up and helps to build and foster trust with folks. And so, shout out to our colleagues, Pam McClinton and Suja Matthews, who very early on in our work gave us the phrase soft landings. And so those are things that have been really critical tools for us as we've worked both with city staff and community over the course of these 3 years. Yeah, I'll pass it to you.
I love hearing Danita talk about lessons learned. The one that I'll round out on this slide is just about embracing interdependence and solidarity. And, without this, none of the former conditions for trust are really possible. I think what we really learned through this whole process is when you are centering care, when you are centering people, you are centering ways to be genuinely in solidarity with folks, as whole beings. So figuring out what worked and didn't, giving and receiving feedback, encouraging each other's growth and efforts in and outside our work together was transformative. So I think you see there's a picture of people, all of our community advisory council members on the screen. And if not for anything else, just saying every one of these people were incredible organizers, educators, or just leading initiatives across the city that had incredible value and impact. But they would show up in our toolkit work, and we would have sort of goals for our time together. I think making space for learning about each other, learning about each other's lived experiences. We, for example, set up time and structured our bi-weekly meetings to allow for different folks to just share whatever they wanted to share, and also to share initiatives with each other, and also build relationships with each other. And in all honesty, that made the advisory council that much stronger, that made trust so much more greater through our process, because people came in kind of wary, to be honest. People came in thinking, what is this toolkit? It's so ambitious. How is what I say going to actually be used and impact anything? And I think through the process of genuinely caring for each other, we were able to also dream into possibilities that we were all not sure about, right? Or not initially trusting. The last set of lessons, learned is really around equity as a process, not a destination. So the first in this is just that equitable commitments cost something. And I'm gonna reference this quote from Cole Arthur Riley. I think they write Black liturgies. Pity is not solidarity. Despair is not solidarity. Solidarity is the kind of presence that costs you something. And in the work of stewarding and co-creating the toolkit, we witness these costs, and these costs are generational, right? Like equity gaps didn't happen just yesterday. They happened from long-standing divestment. And so, for example, within a resource-constrained institution, new programs, equity-oriented programs, we require us to reallocate funding or ask for budget, requests into the future. And, while buy-in and agreement at the beginning of visioning is all there, conditions can change. And I think we saw that through the mayoral transition, right? Everyone sort of is put into scarcity mode around, oh no, we need to protect certain aspects of our programming, certain aspects of our budget. And so that's just to say, keeping in mind that equity always asks us, what are you willing to stake to repair, to bridge gaps? And just recognizing that up front and putting that in your scopes and just really, really like holding to that it costs something. I think the second lesson for me here was really around equity as a lifelong practice. And what this is the antidote to fearing failure, right? Or the hopelessness and despair that comes with things that maybe don't work, right? And seeing like equity as a lifelong practice, it has us embodying a growth mindset. And it has me thinking about Marian Cabo, this abolitionist writer, scholar, who talks about 1,000,000 experiments to get us towards a liberatory world, because we all haven't experienced it. And, you know, to embed it in a system, right, is also something we're hoping and wishing for. So building a toolkit or a program or a thing doesn't mean that we are now equitable. This toolkit does not make us now equitable. I think that's important to say, because the commitment to living the practices, to improving upon the practices that were written into the guidance, is the whole point. And so being open to moments where we are so distant from that guidance and still pursuing ways to practice it are actually really courageous. And I think that's something I've taken away. So let it not lead you to despair when it doesn't work out. Just, what are you learning? And I think the last piece is just change as process, not output. So it's a lesson, I think, that I took away from unexpected seeds that were planted during the collaboration process. And this idea that, okay, change happens at the end is actually maybe short-sighted, in the sense that we saw change happening as we were advocating, as we were making this toolkit. And so, for example, while we were building the toolkit with stakeholders, the conversations we were having about engagement began to elevate the value of community engagement for folks who, may not have been told it was valuable or seen it as valuable. We were beginning to make a case for it. We were building language and awareness around why it was important to invest in equitable engagement and the impact it would have on trust and even the services, policies, and programs we could deliver. There was also no mechanism to compensate residents at the time. And I think in pursuit of doing this work, our colleagues began to have to look at procedures and policies to address this gap. And so as of last month, our colleague Hannah Louie launched the Resident Compensation Fund to further support equitable engagement citywide, and create a mechanism for folks to do this long term. I think another piece of this is we saw an increase in people hiring for engagement roles, whereas before we heard stories about people sending out a Vista or an intern to facilitate really tender and complex conversations. And so that's just to say that the process of collaboration can seed all of these changes, and it doesn't have to come at the end. These are just a few of our lessons. And we just want to thank you for journeying through this presentation with us, but also just open up for conversations, because I think that's where a lot of neediness lives.
Well, thank you so much. And I love seeing all of the light bulbs and the plus signs in the chat as you were presenting. I think that there's a lot of interest, and so I'm going to get into some of the questions that have come up. And a reminder for our attendees: you can head over to the chat if you have questions of your own. But let's get started with a great question from Madeline in Multnomah County, Oregon. To co-create, how do you engage Philadelphians to create the questions to ask community? And then an observation: too often we decide the research questions and then we go into community to ask the questions we have crafted without them. So how do you engage people in co-creation? And then again, another great point where she says, I believe that if we ask questions, we can engage community in the analysis of their community data and give back to community what we heard. And if we don't share that back, it is a kind of theft.
Yeah, totally agree. And just really appreciate this question, Madeline. I think, we could probably take it a couple of ways. So I'll go one way and I'm sure Andrea will go another. We're like yin and yang. So this is what happens. So welcome. I think one thing that we did often was that we would come with questions and always create space and time to say, are these the right questions? Or is there anything that you would change? Is there anything that you would add? I think prefacing it with, when you first engage with folks, let them know if it's going to be something that is going to last over time. I think often what I heard from community members when we were doing research early on was they were like, is this going to be the only time that I'm going to talk to you? Or is there going to be a window, or is there going to be a pathway that I can email you? Can I call you? And that, like, when you come and be upfront about that, is basically setting an agenda with folks and saying, I'm going to come, we're doing some preliminary thinking. What we need is for you to help us draft questions, like just state it explicitly as possible, because that gives people their agency to then say, all right, I can show up and tell you what questions you need to ask. And I can tell you that that's the wrong question. What you really need to be asking about is X, Y, and Z. That's how they roll in Philly. So that's what I would say, is to just make sure that you're building in that time to create space to generate and facilitate a conversation. And once people know that you're serious about that, they're more than willing to help out. And then, you know, on the opposite times, there are moments when you probably are just going to be like, these are the questions that we have to ask at this time. Be straight up about that as well. And, you know, say there won't be opportunity for you to weigh in. There won't be opportunity to be feedback. People just want you to keep it real.
Yeah, I always in alignment with Danita. I think, you know, I come from community organizing, and I think I came with a really like with this question. I was like, community has to co-create the questions from the start, but we have to recognize our conditions. Like, it's a very hierarchical space we work within in city government or in government in general. Decision-making pathways led by community have to be created like from like the ground, I think. And we're speculating, I think, in this area by having a community co-design practice area, right? What does it look like to field like not even just, you know, it's like opportunities for improvements from community. How do we, and there's some initiatives already happening. There's like a Philadelphia Voices team that is surveying Philadelphians to understand what they care most about to prioritize, you know, program service improvement, policy improvements. But I'd say that, you know, there are moments where if the power to decide is just not going to be given to community, then we need to be honest, like Danita is saying. And that's where the sort of more collaborative, like, we're coming with the things that leadership is open to sharing decision making around. Here are some questions that leaders care about, that, you know, but like, what do you care about? And then being the facilitator of that. I think that's how I found like being able to honor like the voices of community and their needs, and also the realities of the space that we work within. We've also experimented with sharing back raw or even synthesized data. And, you know, I think a really big part of that was, you know, experimenting with what consentful, there's an amazing group, Consentful Tech, who talks about consent as an ongoing process. What does it look like for someone, just, you know, you're interviewing them for an hour and then you take that word as like God, you know, but the reality is like our ideas and our experiences shift with the context of a conversation. And so giving them that opportunity to just like process at a lower, you know, slower pace, and then give us back more. Often we would get more data, or people would just affirm like, oh, thanks for hearing me. Or there's also that outlier, you know, who's like, I got my gift card. I'm good. And so there's just that spectrum and that reality. And I think it's just like understanding the nuance. Yeah.
A question here from Mihal in the city of Seattle, and this is in response to placing Philadelphians at the top of your org structure. Was that your team's doing, or is that a view from the mayor's office or political leadership more broadly?
Oh, I think, are you referring to the slide that we had with the, okay, I was like, what is the origin of this question? I think that slide is really just showing where the Service Design Studio sits within the organization. But I think to answer that question, I think it's, oh, so sorry. A combination of two things. Like, I think the work that Leanna and our teammate Devika were able to do early on, like, proved the value of service design, and the way that we work with our project partners within the city, like, it sort of spreads by word of mouth. And then we've also been really fortunate to have an amazing leader in our Chief Administrative Officer, Stephanie Tipton, who, because of the purview and she operates at a cabinet level position, has been really adamant and intentional about us partnering with other organizations and trying to improve service delivery. And so service design is a really great tool and method that enables us to do that. So I hope that answers your question. But if not, let me know.
Well, and maybe I'll ask it like a slightly different way. So do you feel like that your work extends to that political sphere of city government? Like, do you find that your elected leaders are learning from your work, using the toolkit, coming to you, or are they still using maybe more traditional methods of like how city government is structured?
I think we're shifting the tide little by little. We've had folks from city council reach out like through the constituent services office and be like, hey, I'm in a community meeting and someone's talking about this toolkit. What is it? Within Philly, like the way we operate, we're sort of separate from the city council. Like we don't work with them in a day-to-day capacity. We're sort of running in parallel a lot. And the toolkit has been something that we've been able to have folks reach out and be like, we need to learn more about this. Like what's in it? It can be beneficial. How can we leverage this? Or how can we get training on it? Are there other meetings? We've directed people to the Equitable Engagement Collaborative, which is the space where the toolkit was really birthed. But that's citywide. Practitioners that do community engagement are all in that space. And so we've tried to, and what we've seen is that people in coming to that space then are able to sort of take the toolkit and its learnings back into that political work and trying to figure out how do we shift from operating in those more traditional methods that frankly residents and community folks are telling us that this we need to do better.
And that's great to hear that uptake might be happening and that they're not just gauging it on, well, I received 15 phone calls and that is representative of what I'm hearing. So a great question here from Karina, who wants to know the types of technology that you're using to collect and analyze data and report back to the community. And then if you can share the process by which you selected that tool.
Yeah, I mean, we know of all the fancy qualitative coding and coding tools out there. I would say, we used very sort of basic tools and largely, Otter to transcribe a lot of our transcripts and a lot of our sort of facilitated conversations were either virtual or in person. So that recording or even artifacts like workshop, I don't know, like templates and stuff that we had people fill in, or if we did like sort of a facilitated activity with sticky notes, I think often we would take all of that into Miro and then from there do high level sort of synthesis of topical sort of things that we had cross-coded. And then we actually built a really big database with all of the quotes and data points that we had to kind of do sense making and figure out, okay, what is going to go into the guidance. In terms of reporting back, I think the step in between gathering raw data, pulling out like key insights, right, and synthesizing that, it was at that point that we would put it into a document and share it back with folks in community, just something a little more readable, something that we were going to use, right? So I think that was like a big point too. Like, it's like, hey, we're going to use this as an insight. Do you still feel strongly about this? Is this accurate? Did we capture it correctly? Those were kind of the tools we used. I would say just a suite of Microsoft SharePoint tools after that, just because of our proxy security situation.
So we're getting close to time. So I'm going to throw out there to our attendees, if you have a last question, throw it in the chat now, but I'll ask one. So if you knew then what you know now, what would you have done differently when you were starting this work?
Oh my goodness, in 5 minutes. That could be the whole hour. Um, I think if I knew one thing that I'll pull on is something that comes up a lot, that I think I'm always grappling with, and that is how do we celebrate joy and our wins amidst the really hard and difficult work. And I remember very early on we had this really like rambling conversation around like what would it look like to measure joy. I think this work has been really difficult. It's taken a lot out of Andrea and I personally, because once people start to tell you the stories of their experiences and their challenges engaging with city government and it hasn't gone well, um, it sits in you. And, it takes a lot of heart and a lot of energy and a lot of invisible work that happens. Our director, Leanna, hustled for us so many times when we would be out in community, and I'll always reference this, but there was one person that was like, the city is paying a white man from Penn $250 an hour for his time, and y'all are offering me a $40 gift card. What? Come on now. So, and we ran back, and then we've always had teammates and leadership that have advocated and have figured out, and we've made ways. And as I look back over these 3.5 years, because we were so invested in just creating this thing, we didn't take time to like really celebrate those moments, that have now surfaced into now there's a citywide resident compensation fund that was in large part spurred by that work. So I think that for me is something that if I had to do it all over again, I would bake in hard and fast, like unmovable reflection checkpoints for us, to really evaluate and just check in emotionally and just as people, but also find ways to really tell those invisible stories because it helps folks really relate and understand the breadth and depth of this work.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, Danita. I think the one thing I'll say is just that there, I think sometimes when you facilitate this work, there's this sense that like I think inequity can live within us. Like, and it's just dominant culture, right? It's just the default. And what we're trying to live into is something different. We're trying to really live into a different world. And it's a world we have yet to embody, right? And so Danita talking about this moment where we're talking to a community member and they're looking at us and she's like, you two folks of color should know better, right? In so many ways, coming with a $40 gift card and coming from community organizing and having this relationship with this person that came from that space, right? I was like, I should have known better. But when you come into these institutions and these spaces are made are rooted in colonialism, are rooted in white supremacy culture. We are not outside of it. Even though I'm a daughter of immigrants, when I enter this space, the rules, the things that have been told, like you only have $40 to give. So I went out and asked someone if they would participate for $40. I think the biggest thing I've learned or I would redo is coming from that place of understanding that all these rules are arbitrary, that somebody had made them in the image of dominant culture. We need to refuse and we need to think outside of that. So I think that's how we began to move differently, but I think I would have given ourselves a little more permission to do that more.
I want to thank you both so much for sharing your time. And as again, we can see in the chat, I think there are many people that are going to want to connect with you either on LinkedIn or directly over email. So thank you for sharing your contact information in the chat. Again, we did record this. We're going to write a recap with the help of our student analysts, and we'll be sharing all of that back out with the subnetwork. Again, we'd love if you are joining us for the first time, we'd love for you to join our mailing list. We do a monthly newsletter where we summarize all of the great work happening in governments large and small around digital services and user experience. And then we do have a very robust resource library. You can head to digitalservicenetwork.org, and this is where we collect artifacts and public goods that you can use in your own organization to help advance your work. And then lastly, we always appreciate feedback. So we'll put a feedback link here in the chat and would love to hear about your thoughts on this event and how we could potentially do better in the future. But most of all, please join me in visually clapping or waving or sharing an emoji to say thank you to our incredible speakers, Danita and Andrea. Again, we have simply just fallen in love with you and your work and your approach to everything that you're doing in Philadelphia, and just appreciate your time and your work today. So appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and I hope to see you at a future DSN event. Take care, everyone.